Hey guys, this is Mr. Breen, and in this video I'll be talking about epsilon contract verbs. Epsilon contract verbs have a first principle part that looks like this, with an epsilon before the final omega. That is, the dictionary entry will start with this form. However, this is a form that will never actually appear in a Greek text. Instead, this epsilon will contract, but I'll show you that in a second. I'll go through the forms first, and then I'll show you where these forms come from later. So our forms are philo, philes, phile, philumen, phileta, philusi, for first, second, third singular, and first, second, third plural. The infinitive is philein. The second singular and second plural imperative are phile and phileta. So where did these forms come from? Let's take a look. We have a stem, phile, our theme vowels, omicron, epsilon, epsilon, omicron, epsilon, omicron, for the infinitive, epsilon, and for the imperatives, both epsilon. And then we have our endings, blank, s, a, men, te, nsi, n for the infinitive, blank for the second singular imperative, and te for the second plural imperative. All right, so let's see how these things are formed. Normally, this would become omega, and when we have epsilon plus omega, the epsilon just kind of drops out, so we're left with philo. In this second and third singular, we get epsilon, epsilon, epsilon. So when that happens, we combine these two epsilons to get epsilon iota. And then when we throw in another epsilon, it just kind of gets absorbed into that. And so we're just left with epsilon iota. Epsilon plus omicron will give you omicron upsilon. So this becomes philumen. In the second plural, epsilon, epsilon gives you epsilon iota. So we have phileta. For our third plural, we have phileonsi. So in this case, as normal, we get the nu drops out, and that gives you compensatory lengthening, so we get omicron upsilon. And then the epsilon combines with omicron upsilon, but when that happens, the epsilon just kind of gets absorbed, so it's philusi. In the infinitive, philein becomes philein, just like up here. Philea in the second singular imperative becomes phile because epsilon plus epsilon gives you epsilon iota, and the same thing happens in the second plural imperative. Now I want to draw your attention to something that isn't an issue with many other verbs, but is an issue with this one, which is that we have two forms that are spelled just alike, and they have different persons and numbers. So we have phile, which is third singular, and we have phile, which is second singular imperative. How can you tell the difference? Well, phile, third singular, has an accent mark on the last syllable, whereas phile, the second singular imperative, has an accent mark on the iota on the first syllable. So why does that happen? Well, with verbs, the accent is what you call recessive. That means it goes back as far as it can, and it can only go back 3 syllables at most. If the last accent is long, then it pulls the accent back toward the back of the word by 1 syllable, so it'll go on the second to last syllable, which we call the penultimate. In phileo, this is going to be an omega, so that long syllable draws the accent to the epsilon, but the epsilon just gets absorbed into the omega anyway, so the accent ends up on the last syllable. In phileas, the accent would go here, 3 back, the third syllable back. But because all of these get absorbed into 1, it just ends up on this last syllable. Same thing here. Okay, in phileomen, it would normally go on the epsilon, but the epsilon and omicron combine, so it goes on the second to last syllable. The same thing happens in the second plural. And in phileonsi, it would go on the epsilon. The epsilon and omicron combine, we get philusi. In the infinitive, the same thing happens. Philein becomes philein. But in philea, the accent would go on the iota, the third from the back. And we have epsilon and epsilon combining, but the accent stays there, phile. And for the second plural imperative, phileeta, okay, the accent would go here, that's the third from the back, but these two combine, and we get phileta. So that's sort of a long way of telling you that's how you can tell the difference between this form, this third singular indicative, and this form, the second singular imperative. Here are some more examples of epsilon contract verbs and the way that their forms look. Poio, poies, poie, poiumen, poieta, poiusi, poiein, poie, and poieta. Noticing again the difference between second singular indicative and, third singular indicative and second singular imperative. And oiko, oikes, oike, oikumen, oiketa, oikusi, oikein, oike, oiketa, noticing again the difference between third singular indicative and second singular imperative. So go ahead and get some practice with these forms. Take these words that you see from the verb kaleo, meaning to call, and change them from singular to plural or from plural to singular. I'm going to just pause for a second. You guys should pause the video while you're writing, and in a few seconds I'll put the answers up on the screen.